Hi everyone, I'm Lee and today I'm going to make a server-side rendering introduction. Before I start diving into that subject, I want to introduce myself. 7 years ago, I started as a QA at a startup that is called Minute Media, which is also where I am currently working at. 1 year later, I left to Beersheba to learn computer science. While being a student, I had my very first job as a front-end developer. After graduation, I came back to Minute Media, and this time as a front-end developer, and today I am a team leader. Since I came back to Minute Media as a developer, I had multiple chances to talk with other people from the same professional field. And I was trying to explain what I'm doing in my current job. And I was saying that I am a developer and I'm using React and Redux, and we have a service that renders the HTML, which is basically server-side rendering method. And more than once I got questions about that subject. What is this exactly server-side rendering method? And how can we render HTML in the server? This is why I decided today to talk about that and explain what server-side rendering is and what are the great benefits that come with it. I want to start with the word rendering. We all know that when a user enters a website page, what he sees is represented by an HTML markup. And the question is, where was this HTML markup created? In the client or in the server? If it is created in the client, it means that the browser had to run some JavaScript code in order to generate the full HTML markup. And this is the client-side rendering method. In client-side rendering method, the flow is that the user enters the website page, a request is sent to the server response includes index.html with JavaScript code that runs in the browser and then generates the full HTML for the client. This method might be more familiar because many libraries and frameworks in JavaScript tend to use that method in their documentations. For example, React used this method in its documentation for Create React App, which is a very popular and comfortable way to start building React applications from scratch. Here's an example for an application in React using client-side rendering method. Let's say that what we see in the right side, the index.html, is the response from the server. We can see that the markup is almost empty. It includes one div with no content in it. In the left side is the code that must be run in the browser in order to generate the HTML markup. So the browser generates the HTML markup with the header, content, and footer, and then injects this markup into the div with the ID root that we got from the response from the server. And this is how we generate the markup in the client side. So the content here depends on the code. We might start getting a sense of why client-side rendering can damage our user experience. Before we had the ability to generate full HTML markup by JavaScript in the browser, like the example that we just saw with React or Angular or Vue.js, servers had to return the full HTML markup in their response to the client. So server-side rendering is not a new method. This method has always been there even before we had the option to use client-side rendering. Server rendered the HTML by returning a static HTML file or by processing the HTML markup via some JavaScript, some server-side languages like Java, Python, or PHP. Today we have Node.js, which is a great backend environment to render HTML in the server side. It has the amazing benefit, which is using JavaScript in the server. And it means that we have an isomorphic code that can be run both in client and in server sides. We can definitely take advantage of it and use almost the exact same code that we use in order to generate the HTML in the client side, but this time in the server side. Back to the example that we saw before, let's try to turn it into server-side rendering. So before the server sends back the response, it assembles the HTML markup in the server. We can see here the code that runs in the server in order to generate the markup. It generates the markup with the header and the content and the footer. And the code is not that different than what we saw before. It is JavaScript, it is React, and the only difference is the usage of the library React DOM server, which is a library of React that enables us to create React applications in the server. So when we generate the markup in the server side, we can save it in a variable. For example, here is the variable called HTML. And then we can inject it into the response that we send back to the client in the index HTML. And this is how the client gets the full HTML markup in the response from the server. And this is server-side rendering. Because HTML markup is rendered on the website server, both search agent bots and humans get a faster page experience. For humans, it means better UX. In client-side rendering, the browser has to download the JavaScript file and execute the JavaScript code before it could display the page content. In the meanwhile, the human has to deal with a blank page, which is a bad indicator for user experience. Server-side rendering solves it by serving the full HTML immediately to the client. For agent bots, it means better SEO. When Google and other search agents bots try to access a website page, instead of having to wait for JavaScript to be executed in order for the page to become available, they'll get the fully rendered page right from the server. This eliminates the risk of partial indexing that can happen with client-side rendering. In addition to SEO and UX, server-side rendering gets us a better performance. Not every device is the same in terms of hardware capabilities. A page rendering on the client side relies on this device hardware while rendering. A low hardware may fail to render the entire page in optimal time. Since in server-side rendering, HTML is rendered server-side, the devices have little relevance to the load time of your page. Since most servers are capable enough, the load time of all devices visiting the website is consistent. Here we get three great benefits using server-side rendering: UX, SEO, and performance, which they altogether lead to better achievements and more revenue for our website. I explain what server-side render is and what are the great benefits that come with it. However, there's still one issue that I want to talk about. What happens if our website page is too large and requires a lot of data from network requests, like we see here in this example? This example is the same example as we saw before, only with the recommendations section. What if this recommendations section requires many requests to different services that we didn't have to communicate up until now? What if it takes time and we don't want to wait too long before we send back the response to the client? Maybe it is better if this recommendation section could be excluded from the rendering process in the server side. We might want to consider a third approach, which is hybrid rendering. Hybrid rendering is rendering a page on both client and server sides, rendering the most important content in the server and the less important in the client. How can we render a specific part of our page in the client side? Well, we can do it in multiple ways. We can add to our bundle JavaScript code and we know that runs in the client some JavaScript that only renders the HTML by an action. For example, on click event or on scroll event, or maybe using intersection observer that can include some JavaScript code that generates the HTML when this HTML enters the user viewport. In React, we have a special hook that is called useEffect. By using this hook, you tell React that your component needs to do something after it renders. React will remember this function that you passed and call it later after performing the DOM updates. The important thing is that useEffect does not work on the server side, and we can use it in order to get the hybrid rendering. Here's the example for the code of the recommendation sections component. We see here that the recommendation markup is only rendered when it includes articles. And the initial values of this component is an empty array. So the recommendation will not render the markup up until it will have the articles. And we can also see that we are using the hook of React, which is useEffect, and the functions that we are passing to it is including the fetch recommendations function, which is a network request. And only when we get the response from this network request, we update the articles of the recommendation sections, and only then the component re-renders and generates the markup of this section. Because of the way that useEffect works, we can be sure that the functions that we pass into the useEffect will not be executed in the server side. So basically, the recommendation component will not generate the markup in the server side. So when we return from the server the response to the client, the index.html, it will include the full HTML markup, however, without the recommendation section. So we excluded the recommendation component from the rendering process in the server side, and it will only take place in the client side because of the way that we wrote JavaScript code for that component. And this is how we get the hybrid approach, the hybrid rendering. With the hybrid method, we get even better UX and performance because the page loads faster and the user gets to see the most important content almost immediately. So my recommendation is to combine those two methods, combine them and have better scores for performance, SEO, and UX. Thank you.